Okay, welcome to week 2 of Psychology 101, Introduction to Psychology, and this is the Psychologist. So we're still in the historical phase of going through the history of psychology. You've noticed I've got a microphone here. That was because I was told that the volumes fluctuated a little bit when I was talking, so this is to kind of even and balance things out. So, who are psychologists? Well, we have the father of hypnotism, or hypnosis, Franz Mesmer. We have our first experimental psychologist with Wilhelm Wundt. And then we have the psychologist William James. So, the father of hypnosis with Franz Mesmer. Now, Dr. Franz Mesmer was a physician that used magnets to treat disorders of the mind through the hypothesis that the body's magnetic fields needed to be realigned through the use of magnets. And so you're probably asking, well, how did he come by this hypothesis? Well, he was always fascinated with magnetism, and so when this lady in, I want to say it was like 1776, treated this one with what was called hysterical neurosis. Now, that's what we call somatization disorder, which is like a pain disorder, basically. He used a set of magnets and touched different places of her body with them and was able to suggest to her that her symptoms were going to disappear through this treatment. Of this curing of her neurosis, it became this sensation all over Vienna. And this, what I mean by sensation, he was giving lectures, demonstrations, he was taking people out of the audience and giving them his treatment with the magnets and stuff like that up until about 1777, when he offended many of the city of Vienna's most influential doctors. Amid his claims that offended them was that he was able to partially cure a woman who was blind. She was blind since the age of 3. She came to see him when he was 18, and only in his presence only was she able to partially recover her sight, with the suggestion that her blind was psychosomatic, that it was all in her mind. And so this was what caused her parents to stop her from going to see him in 1778. And the doctors of Vienna all got together and denounced him as a charlatan, a hack, and a fraud. And shortly after this, Mesmer left his practice in Vienna and moved to Paris, France. In France, he started experimenting with an oak tub filled with water and iron fillings to make this magnetic fluid that he called, is what he called it. And it was used to treat people through different ailments, excuse me. So Franz Mesmer, he noticed that through touch, gestures, and even with long, intense looks, he was able to influence the magnetism in his patients. And that's because he thought he could influence the magnetic fields that person gave off through this invisible magnet fluid stuff that apparently flowed between him and the patient, and that he can influence those fields. And so this became known as mesmerism. And this was a treatment that came to be called the IT treatment all over Paris at the time. Of course, the faculty at the University of Paris were not impressed, and so they came out, they watched a few of his treatments where he would mesmerize people, and they of course called him a fake and a fraud, and he challenged them to investigate his treatments and test their validity, because he was so convinced that what he was doing was actually scientifically accurate. Now, this commission of doctors, academics, even included the ambassador to France at the time, Benjamin Franklin, who carefully studied his methods. And what they found is this magnetic fluid that was invisible that flowed between him and the patient that influenced their magnetic field was considered non-existent. And so they figured out the treatment was actually due to imagination and suggestion. And so because of this, the popularity of mesmerism kind of waned and died down, and Mesmer himself left France, spent the last 30 years of his life in seclusion, basically in Switzerland. But this was the end of mesmerism. There was a French physician who had decided that there was perhaps something to be salvaged in Mesmer's techniques. And so he got rid of all of the mystical and the metaphysical theories that were associated with mesmerism and came to call this technique hypnotism. And so he was able to use hypnosis to cure the symptoms that many of his patients would complain of, whether it was hysterical neurosis, anxiety, insomnia. And so through this process, by 1860, his treatments had vindicated in some small visceral part of Mesmer's claims, and these claims were, of course, the therapeutic ones. And so mesmerism practiced as what's known as hypnotherapy. But when it comes to experimental psychology, Wilhelm Wundt is the person that is considered the father of modern psychology. And so this was kind of conceptualized around 1879 at the University of Leipzig. And this is where you had the first recorded laboratory experiment into measuring reaction times between stimulus and response. And so what happened was Wundt, Max Frederick, and Stanley Hall, who happened to be the only American in the room, they set up an experiment to measure the time that would elapse when a ball was dropped and a telegraphing key would be hit using a chronoscope, which was kind of like a stopwatch at the time. And so this chronoscope would measure the duration of the apperception, that's the duration of the time between the fall of the ball and the hitting of the key on the telegraph. And so this laboratory, which was like, I think this old like dilapidated room in this university, would be called a institute, because that was like the German word for laboratory at the time was institute. And so because of this, Wundt is considered the founder of modern psychology. Now, he personally supervised over 200 dissertations in Europe and America, which means Americans would leave, come to Germany. He would oversee their experiments, their learning, and their dissertations that they would write to get their doctorate degree. And he also wrote many scholarly articles and books that would establish psychology as an objective science. In fact, Wundt is considered the first scientist to be called a psychologist rather than a physicist or a philosopher. He was just with an interest in psychology, because that's what most of the early psychologists were philosophers or physicists who had just had an interest in the mental processes of the mind. So Wundt restored the study of the conscious mental processes to psychology and rejected introspection in favor of scientific approach to psychological phenomena, or psychology without a soul, as one would tend to put it. But that doesn't mean that he left introspection alone, which I'll get to. While other scientists had used experimental means to measure certain mental processes and responses, it was Wundt who fully developed the methods or the methodology to carry out the psychological experiments that would be taking place in Leipzig. Now, researchers in Wundt's laboratory did not study, a lot of things that the modern psychologists do today. So it wasn't like personality or the unconscious. It wasn't emotions or anything like that. Just perception, sensation, and reaction times. And they even avoided abnormal behavior. So he wasn't a physician that worked in, like, say, a hospital or anything like that. Now, coming back to introspection, Wundt's favorite method of investigating it was trained introspection. And you might say, well, what does that mean exactly? Well, wherein this, only those that were trained by him could observe their own sensations, their mental images and processes, and their emotional states and reactions. But they had to make 10,000 practice observations before actively observing their own. So that was trained introspection. You couldn't just write down what you were thinking. You had to make practice observations first before you were sufficiently trained enough to even start doing the real thing. So Wilhelm Wundt was very concentrated on the actual empirical methodology to get the same results through testing hypotheses. So he was stuck dogmatically to the scientific method on this, which is a good thing if you want psychology to be a science rather than just an extension of philosophy. And so by end of that, we get to the flip side of that, which is the functionalists, which psychologist William James was a functionalist first and foremost. So in America, Wundt's ideas were opposed by the psychological school of functionalism. And this was the study of the function and purpose of behavior rather than a description of it and an analysis. So it wasn't like this is what this is. It was less about that, but rather about how something is and why it happens. How does the consciousness work and why do we have consciousness? How are emotions working and why do we have them? Those sort of questions. And coming back to emotion, we'll get to that here in a second. So, functionalist and psychologist William James. William James was born in 1842, died in 1910. He attended many schools in his youth from the United States, England, France, Switzerland, and Germany. And that was because he had different thoughts about medicine, philosophy, and all these different things. So he wasn't quite sure where he was going to go. But he ended up studying under physiologist Helmholtz. After failed attempts at chemistry and medicine at Harvard, he ended up going back to Germany, studying under Dr. Helmholtz. And through his tutelage under Helmholtz, he became conversant with the new school of psychology, which was the experimental school through Wilhelm Wundt. So he returned to Harvard as a professor of philosophy, which he taught for about a decade, which then he changed his title to a professor of psychology in 1889. Now, like Wundt, he did experiments in the laboratory, though he absolutely loathed it, despite it. Thought working in a laboratory was absolutely terrible and horrific. And so one of the things he would do is he would have his students whirl frogs around. So he'd spin them around just to explore the functions of the inner ear. And one of the hypotheses that he had was that if you did the same to deaf-mute people, they would not be subject to dizziness because the inner ear canal was damaged. And so through testing this, he come to find out that that was actually correct. And I just kind of wonder how he was able to get the consent to do this, because they couldn't talk, let alone hear what he was saying. But I'm pretty sure they probably learned how to read. So some of the ideas that William James had was very influential on what would come to be modern psychology. So he had the functionalist aspect with the complex processes of the mind as they were evolved for adaptation and for life preservation rather than just they are. And he looked at the nature of the mind, and he was not really impressed with dualism or the spiritual aspect, so he thought of a dualism of perspectives. You have external objects and our knowledge of them as objects. They're just there, and we know what they are. And then there's the material world and the sets of the mind states within relation to that material world. So that's the way that Wilhelm looked at the nature of the mind, is that you have an objective world and a material world, and our conscious mind states just reflect those states of the world and our experience of objects. He also looked at the stream of thought of consciousness, and so he thought of consciousness not as separate from the mind, but was more of a process for adapting behavior to circumstances as they came and as they come and as they arise. And so that's kind of like you have yourself in the material world, you have an object, and then consciousness was the process of adapting your behavior into the circumstances of the material world and that object. And then, of course, he thought about the self. And what was really cool is he believed that the self was a distinct principle of selfhood, and that it was integral to the common sense of mankind. So it wasn't just the soul self, but the self as the person within the world, and how that would manifest itself in relation to everything in the world. And this, of course, brought into his perception on will. He wasn't too sold on willpower so much from one school of thought or the other, but looked at it as a supply of information from experience that drove a person to a desired end. So he looked at will as motivation. And motivation's kind of tied into emotion, which we'll get to when we discuss motivational psychology and emotion and motivation. And so Now, this idea, of course, kind of disappeared and waned between the 1920s and the 1960s when you get to the behaviorist school of psychology, which we'll discuss there to a degree. And, of course, then there's his thoughts on the unconscious. And in some parts, he thought that the sum total of mind was conscious, that everything we know is consciously done, but there are other aspects that he recognized that were unconscious processes, such as heart rate, respiration, all that. We just do it. We're unconscious of the processes of that. And so we didn't just consciously attend to those, we unconsciously attended to them. That was kind of his way of thinking about the unconscious. Not so much like Jung thought of the deep down unconscious, where like the archetypes and collective representations of mankind, which when we get to talk about Jung and the analytical school of psychology, we'll really go in depth with that, so that we can totally explore the unconscious and all of that. But we're just touching on it here with William James. But we're going to get to what William James really brought to the table, and what he brought was emotion. William James is really well known in the school of emotional psychology. And so, in fact, James's theory of emotion is his most well-known and heavily researched even today. As close to 1992 as we're still looking into James's theories on emotion. And his idea was that emotions that we feel are not what causes the bodily symptoms or the physiological changes in the body, such as, increased heart rate, sweaty palms, and feeling hot under the collar, or a raise in body temperature. That's not what William James thought about emotion. He thought of the physiological changes were just the nervous system reacting to external stimuli, and our perception of those changes are what we call emotions. So you have like fear, for example. You have an external stimulus that causes your heart rate to increase, your blood pressure rises, your body temperature decreases, and that change is called fear. And so you get the James Lange's theory of emotion, where Danish psychologist Carl Lange worked on the same theory at roughly the same time. Now, James acknowledged Lange's work, but they did not collaborate on this. But it was still known as the James Lange theory of emotion in textbooks today. And through experimentation, there are a lot of ways where the theory is faulty, even though some ways it's inherently true. So Harvard psychologist Walter Cannon found different emotions share similar physiological manifestations. So let's take fear and anger, because those are really two good ones that share similar physiological changes, but the emotions are completely different. So anger, of course, your heart rate increases, your blood pressure raises, your body temperature raises, and you're more willing to act aggressively to remove a undesirable object that stands between you and a goal, let's say. Okay, and then there's fear. Fear causes your heart rate to increase, your blood pressure increases, you still sweat, your body temperature decreases, and your fight or flight response is activated to where you run away from the external stimuli that makes you that made you afraid. Whereas with anger, you are willing to go into fight and to forcibly remove said object in the world that caused you anger versus running away from it, which is flight or from fear. And so that's how those are two significant emotions that have some of the very similar, in fact, they share more similar physiological changes than they do differ, but they're still two different emotions, if that makes sense. So that's another way of thinking about that, I think. And so this bloody thing. Okay, so concluding this lecture, so we know that there were three very important founders for the new science of psychology. So this is where psychology is moving out of the realm of philosophy and into the realm of actual empirical science. You have Mesmer, the hapless man with the ability for self-promotion, because that's how he was able to get famous for his theories, and people would come to his lectures and demonstrations. He was really good at self-promotion. And his haphazard treatments led to what is now called hypnosis. Why do we say haphazard? Well, obviously, water with iron shavings isn't going to treat anything or cure anything. Same thing with the idea that he's affecting the magnetic fluid that flows between him and the person he's trying to treat. But through suggestion and all of that, hypnosis was found of that, and hypnotherapy is what some psychologists use or some therapists use today. You have Wilhelm Wundt, who is considered the father of experimental psychology, and his laboratory work set the standard for what psychologists do in the laboratory today, mostly your research psychologists and stuff like that. And then finally, you have William James, the functionalist, who was more interested in how and why, and he influenced the research into emotions and how we can research them empirically. And so that's the end of Lecture 2 into Psychology 101. The next lecture will go into depth psychology, and we'll talk about Freud at great length. And then we'll see where the rabbit hole goes with that. So, see you next time.